I'm afraid probably I'm going to start by just saying a couple of words about how I think PERDA affects us, because we are a decision-making body, we're a public body. However, we do not report into any government department. We don't report to government ministers. We are an independent rail and road regulator. So the way I'm interpreting that is that we don't make new announcements. So, for example, in terms of roads, we were going to publish for consultation a new monitoring and enforcement approach with regard to Highways England in the next few weeks. This is anticipating RIS2, how things might or should change in the future. We're not going to do that, I think, for fairly obvious reasons. However, we are still talking about the work that we've done in the past. So what I'm going to do in this session is bring together some of the work that we've already published or spoken about in public, and just try and bring a few themes out from that existing work. So what is the role of the ORR with respect to Highways England? Well, we've got two main jobs. One is to hold Highways England to account for the things it's committed to do in RIS 1. That's a holding to account role. The second is more forward-looking. It's to advise the government on RIS 2. And to do that, we have to scrutinise the plans that Highways England has put together about RIS 2. And in doing that, we draw on the sort of work that Transport Focus does in terms of getting user views on the network. So we're working with Highways England, we're working with Transport Focus, and we're working with government, with the Department of Transport in that role. What are we holding Highways England to account against? Well, there's a scorecard. It's got quite a few rows on it. It's quite detailed, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But I think it's worth just stepping back and saying, what's our high-level conclusion on Highways England's performance to date? And we set this out in an annual assessment that we do. And that's probably one point I do want to emphasise, that we publish quite a lot of information. It's all on our website. Transparency is important to us. There's a lot of data, a lot of analysis. And if you want to read that, all those reports are there. But in our annual assessment of Highways England's performance, we kept it pretty simple. We said that Highways England is taking the right actions to meet the needs of road users. And I think that's quite an important conclusion, because it suggests that Highways England is an outward-looking body. It's focused on what road users need, not just in sense its own internal workings. However, I'm saying that, but if you look at Road 2 up there, road user satisfaction, well, it's below target. So it might only be a bit below target, but it's below target. And going back to the first slide, our job is to hold Highways England to account. So in those sort of cases, we have to challenge Highways England. What can be done further to try and improve that score? And we had detailed conversations with Highways England. We went to the Highways England board on this to discuss it. And the answer was that there were more things that could be done. There was more things that could be done in terms of coordinating incident management. There were more things that could be done in terms of providing information to road users about roadworks. So Highways England, in that case, committed to an improvement plan to try and get that score closer to the target. And that's for us, it's a key part of our challenge role. It's a key part of our holding Highways England to account role. But to do it in a way that allows the company to come back and respond and say, okay, this is what we intend to do, and then to monitor those actions to check that they're being delivered. Just picking on a couple more of these scorecard targets, keeping the network in good condition. Obviously, that's important. It's quite interesting when you look at how this target's compiled. It's very much focused on providing information about whether, the data is very much focused on providing information about whether a road's likely to need resurfacing. And obviously that's important information for asset management. It's not necessarily a good guide to the experience that users are having on the road in terms of how smooth the road is, how it feels. And so it's one of the things that we've fed into the RIS2 work. How well are these measures working? Are they actually telling us what we thought they were going to tell us? There are some areas where we've had disagreements with Highways England about their performance to date, and the efficiency one, I think, is one that stands out for me. So we agree with Highways England that efficiency gains are being made, and that's really important. It's important because a lot of this is publicly funded. However, we don't really agree in terms of the scale of those efficiency improvements. Now, part of that actually comes back to the way the whole efficiency metric and measures were set up at the start of RIS1, and to be fair to everybody involved, there wasn't a lot of experience around that at the time, and we can probably do a lot better in RIS2. But that's an area where we've probably had a slightly different view to date from Highways England. In terms of our input to RIS2, we've provided our input to RIS2. After RIS2 is published, we will publish our input. So obviously, this is a slightly more difficult area now because of where we are on RIS2. But I want to come back to something that Steve mentioned at the start about maintenance and renewals. Because one thing we were determined to do is to give due weight to the plans for maintenance and renewals. Obviously, enhancement schemes, new projects are important. They're important to increase capacity, for example. But sustaining asset condition over time for a business like Highways England is absolutely crucial. And the day job, the core job, is around the maintenance and renewals of the network. And if I could just use a rail analogy here. In the railways, the equivalent of the RIS periods, control periods, again, the 5-year funding periods, they're really useful because they provide basically a 5-year certainty around funding. But what happened in the last 5-year period for rail is that funding came under pressure, enhancement costs were rising, and the rail industry had to defer a lot of the renewals work. It deferred about 20% of renewals work over a period. That was something around, I think, around £3.5 billion worth of work. It's a long way back from that. There's a lot of catching up to do for that, and Network Rail's had to work really, really hard to make up that backlog on renewals. And so that core job, maintaining and renewing the network, is absolutely fundamental. It might not be the most exciting thing, but it is absolutely fundamental. What are our priorities? Well, we need to keep focusing on the holding to account role, and we intend to do that. There's still a lot to be done in the current control period. So going back, for example, to that point about road users and their satisfaction, is Highways England delivering on the road user improvement plan? But we're also switching our attention to RIS2 and the transition into RIS2. It's fundamental that you need to have a clear baseline for the start of a new RIS period. So Highways England needs to have a delivery plan in place against which it can be measured. We want to learn some of the lessons from RIS1 about, for example, how we measure efficiency and making sure we have an agreed view with Highways England about how efficiency is to be measured over time. But one thing I think is just impossible to underestimate is the transition between RIS periods. And I'm going to draw on another rail analogy here, which is the transition between control periods. 5 years ago, Network Rail got the transition between control periods badly wrong. It was not prepared for the start of the new control period it was moving into. It didn't have its plans in place. It got off to a poor start, and it found it a long way back from there. And then it hit further problems, which led to a deferral of renewals. This time round, this current year, Network Rail has got off to a much, much better start in the control period that it faces. It had its efficiency plans in place, it had its renewals plans in place, it had communicated those plans to people, the supply chain could see what was coming, and that created a very different starting environment for the control period. And we're going to be doing a lot of work with Highways England, with government, on the preparations for the start of the next RIS period to make sure that the plans and the resources are in there to deliver right from the start of the control period, so you get off to a good start and you can sustain that over time. And at that point, I'm going to stop and hand over to the next speaker. Thank you very much indeed.